The thing about water in Texas that most people misunderstand is this. Water is not about abundance. It is about control. A man who controls the water controls everything that lives and grows and moves across the land, because nothing survives without water. And in a country where rain falls unpredictably and wells can go dry without warning, the man who has water when others do not has power that no sheriff or judge or government can match. This is why water rights in Texas have caused more violence than cattle rustling and land disputes combined. This is why families have killed each other over creeks that would not fill a bathtub in wetter country. This is why the great ranchers of the 19th century fought not for grass or cattle, but for the springs and streams and wells that made grass and cattle possible. And this is why Erasmus Cotton, the largest landowner in Bexar County in 1885, had positioned himself as the sole owner of the only reliable well in the settlement of Cottonwood, a well that he had not dug, but had acquired through a combination of legal maneuvering and outright fraud, and from which he now charged every family in the settlement 2 cents per gallon for the water that kept them alive. 2 cents per gallon does not sound like much until you calculate what a family needs. A family of 4 requires approximately 3 gallons per day for drinking and cooking alone. Add washing, add livestock, add the kitchen garden that provides vegetables, and the number rises to 20 or 30 gallons per day for a modest homestead. At 2 cents per gallon, that is 40 to 60 cents per day, which is $4 to $6 per week, which is $16 to $24 per month, which is more than most homesteaders earned from their land in a year of good harvests, and far more than they earned in years when the harvest failed. The families of Cottonwood were not buying water. They were renting their own survival, month by month, from a man who had found a way to own the one thing no one can live without. And when a 12-year-old girl was seen filling a canteen from a creek that ran through Cotton's property, a creek that had been public water before Cotton had bribed the county surveyor to redraw the property lines, that girl became a threat that had to be eliminated. Not because her canteen of water mattered economically, not because she had stolen anything of real value, but because if a child could take water without paying, others might start to think they could too, and the entire system of control that Cotton had built would begin to unravel. Her name was Alma Vance. She was 12 years old. She had been orphaned at 9 when her parents died of fever within a week of each other, leaving her in the care of an aunt who resented the burden, and a community that considered orphans to be objects of charity rather than persons deserving of respect. She had been hungry more often than fed, beaten more often than comforted, and taught by every interaction with the adults of Cottonwood that she was worthless, unwanted, and disposable. The morning she was caught filling her canteen from Cotton's Creek, she had not eaten in 2 days. Her aunt had locked her out of the house as punishment for some minor offense, and she had been surviving on what she could scavenge from the edges of other people's property. The creek was the only water source she could reach without entering Cotton's well yard, where she would have been turned away for inability to pay. She was not stealing, she was surviving. But survival, to Erasmus Cotton, looked exactly like theft when it threatened his monopoly. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Judge Whitfield, who owed Cotton money and favors in quantities that made impartiality impossible, heard testimony from Cotton's foreman that the girl had been seen taking water from the creek on multiple occasions. The girl's aunt testified that Alma was troublesome and dishonest, and probably guilty of worse than water theft, if the truth were known. The girl herself was not allowed to speak in her own defense, because children did not testify in Judge Whitfield's courtroom, which was a convenient rule when the child might say something that contradicted the story the powerful wanted told. The verdict was exile, not imprisonment, because the county had no facility for holding children. Not a fine, because the girl had no money and no one willing to pay on her behalf. Exile, which meant being driven beyond the county line and forbidden to return under penalty of imprisonment for trespassing. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy. A 12-year-old girl, alone, in the Texas Hill Country, with no food, no shelter, no tools, no skills, and no one who cared whether she lived or died. The expectation was that she would not survive the week. Cotton had eliminated his problem, and if the method was cruel, well, the girl was only an orphan, and orphans were disposable. If you want to understand how a 12-year-old exile transformed herself into an engineer, how 6 years of solitary labor created a water system that would save an entire county, and how the men who drove her out would crawl back begging for the water she had learned to capture and store, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Alma walked for 3 days after her exile, moving generally west into the hill country because west was away from Cottonwood, and away was all she wanted. She had a canteen that Cotton's men had mockingly allowed her to fill before driving her beyond the county line, and she had the clothes on her back, and she had nothing else except a fierce determination not to die simply because powerful men had decided she should. On the 4th day, she found the canyon. It was a box canyon, 3 limestone walls rising steep and high, with a narrow entrance that was nearly invisible unless you approached from exactly the right angle. A spring seeped from the rock near the back wall, not enough to create a stream, but enough to support a small pool that never quite dried up, even in the hottest summer. There was grass on the canyon floor, and a few scrubby trees, and the walls provided shade for part of each day and shelter from the worst of the wind. It was a place where a person could survive, if that person was willing to work hard enough and learn fast enough and never give up no matter how difficult things became. Alma was willing. She had no choice but to be willing. The alternative was death, and she had decided on the morning of her exile that she was not going to give Erasmus Cotton the satisfaction of dying. The first year was about survival. She learned to trap rabbits with snares made from twisted grass fibers because she had no wire. She learned which plants were edible and which would make her sick, knowledge gained partly from observation of what the animals ate, and partly from trial and error that left her vomiting more than once. She learned to make fire with a bow drill because she had no matches, a skill that took her 3 weeks of frustrating failure before she finally produced a coal that she could nurture into flame. She learned to build shelter, first a crude lean-to of branches and grass, then a more permanent structure of stacked stone and salvaged wood that kept out most of the rain and some of the cold. She learned that survival was possible, if barely, and that barely was enough to build on. The second year was about water. The spring in her canyon was reliable but small, producing perhaps 5 gallons per day even in the wet season. This was enough for one person, but not enough for the garden she needed to grow vegetables, not enough for any livestock she might someday acquire, not enough for any kind of life beyond the most marginal subsistence. And in the dry season, when the spring sometimes dwindled to a trickle, even her basic needs were barely met. She remembered the creek in Cottonwood, the water that had been declared stolen when she took a canteen full, The water that Cotton now charged 2 cents per gallon for because he had found a way to own what should have belonged to everyone. She remembered the injustice of it, the obscenity of one man claiming ownership of something that fell from the sky, and she decided that she would never be dependent on anyone else's water again. She would create her own. The insight came during a thunderstorm in her second spring in the canyon. She had climbed to a ledge to watch the storm roll in, and she saw how the rain fell on the limestone walls and ran down in sheets, how the water collected in natural channels and flowed toward the canyon floor, how thousands of gallons of water that fell on the rock simply ran off and soaked into the ground and was gone within hours of the storm ending. The canyon was catching water. It just was not keeping it. If she could redirect that runoff, channel it into a container, instead of letting it soak into the soil, she could capture and store enough water during the rainy season to last through the dry season. She would not need the spring. She would not need anyone's well. She would have water that belonged to her because she had built the system that caught it. This is what people who have not experienced water scarcity fail to understand about rainwater harvesting. In a place that receives 30 inches of rain per year, which is roughly what the Texas Hill Country receives, a collection surface of 1,000 square feet will capture approximately 18,000 gallons of water annually. 18,000 gallons is enough to supply a family of 4 for a full year with water left over. The rain is already falling. The water is already there. The only question is whether you catch it or let it run away. Alma did not know these calculations. She had never been to school, had never read a book about hydrology, had never spoken to an engineer. But she understood the principle instinctively, the same way that humans have understood it for thousands of years in dry lands around the world, from the cisterns of Jerusalem to the tanks of India, to the acequias of New Mexico. Water that is not caught is water that is lost. Water that is stored is water that is owned. She began carving channels into the limestone walls of her canyon. It was brutal work. She had no proper tools, only stones that she shaped into crude chisels and a heavy rock that served as a hammer. The limestone was soft enough to carve, but hard enough to resist, and each foot of channel represented hours of pounding and scraping and smoothing. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in places the calluses did not cover. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her back developed a permanent curve from hunching over the stone. But the channels grew, inch by inch, foot by foot, year by year. By the end of her 3rd year in the canyon, she had carved over 200 feet of channels, directing water from the upper walls toward a collection point near her cabin. She had built a stone-lined cistern at that collection point, a hole dug into the canyon floor and lined with flat stones, fitted as tightly as she could manage, sealed with clay she had found in a creek bed miles away and hauled back in loads she could barely carry. The cistern held approximately 500 gallons when full, and after the first good rain following its completion, it was full. 500 gallons of water that belonged to no one but her. 500 gallons that Erasmus Cotton could not charge her for. 500 gallons of freedom, but 500 gallons was not enough. A single dry season could drain a 500-gallon cistern in 2 months, and the Texas dry seasons lasted longer than that. She needed more storage. She needed a reservoir. The dam took 3 years. It was a stone structure built across a narrow point where the canyon walls pinched together about a 1/4 mile above her cabin. She built it by hand, stone by stone, carrying rocks from the canyon floor to the construction site, fitting them together dry without mortar in a technique she had figured out through trial and error. The dam was not tall, perhaps 8 feet at its highest point, but it did not need to be tall. It only needed to hold back enough water to fill the natural basin behind it, a basin that she had calculated, by pacing and estimation, could hold somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 gallons. She was wrong about the capacity. When the dam was completed in her 6th year in the canyon and the first heavy rain filled the reservoir behind it, the basin held over 200,000 gallons. 200,000 gallons of water, captured from rain that would have simply run off and disappeared, stored behind a dam that a banished 12-year-old had built with her bare hands over 3 years of labor that no one had witnessed and no one would have believed. 200,000 gallons is enough water to supply a small town for months. It is enough to irrigate acres of crops. It is enough to keep hundreds of cattle alive through a drought that would otherwise kill them. It is enough, in other words, to make Alma Vance the most important person in Bexar County if the county ever ran out of water. The drought began in the spring of 1891, 6 years after Alma's exile. It began slowly, the way droughts always begin, with a dry month that everyone assumed would be followed by rain, then another dry month, then another. By June, the grass was brown. By July, the creeks had stopped running. By August, the wells were dropping, their levels falling inch by inch as the aquifer that fed them received no replenishment from above. Erasmus Cotton watched his well drop and calculated the economics. As water became scarce, he could charge more. 3 cents per gallon in June, 4 cents in July, 5 cents in August. The families of Cottonwood, already impoverished by years of paying for water, now faced costs that made survival impossible. Some sold their livestock because they could not afford to water them. Some abandoned their homesteads and moved away, leaving behind everything they had built because staying meant dying of thirst. Some stayed and suffered, rationing water to a few sips per day, watching their children grow weak and their crops wither and their future disappear with every cloudless sunrise. By September, Cotton's well had dropped to the point where it could no longer supply the settlement. The great monopolist who had controlled water for a decade found himself with nothing to sell, nothing to leverage, nothing to hold over the desperate families who had been his captive customers. The well was not dry, but it was producing so slowly that there was not enough for everyone, not enough for anyone who was not Erasmus Cotton himself. He stopped selling water on September 15th. He announced that the well was for his household only, that the families of Cottonwood would have to find their own sources, that he was not responsible for their survival. The families had nowhere to go. Every well within 20 miles was dry or nearly so. The creeks that had not been claimed by Cotton had stopped running entirely. The nearest reliable water source was the Guadalupe River, 40 miles to the east, a distance that could not be traveled with enough frequency to keep a family alive. People began to die. The first was old Mrs. Harmon, who had been weakened by years of marginal nutrition and could not survive the dehydration that came when there was no water to drink. The second was the Keller infant, whose mother's milk had dried up because the mother herself was dehydrated and who had no other source of nourishment. The third, fourth, fifth, an accelerating toll as the drought continued, and the water disappeared and hope became something that no one could afford to feel. The rumor began in late September. Someone, somewhere, had heard that there was water in the hill country to the west, a canyon with a spring that never ran dry, a reservoir that held more water than anyone could use. A hermit who lived there alone and had never been seen by anyone in 6 years. The rumor spread the way rumors do in desperate times, growing and embellishing and transforming from a whisper into a certainty that people clung to because the alternative was despair. A search party was organized. 10 men, including Erasmus Cotton himself, rode west into the hill country, looking for the canyon that might or might not exist. They found it on the 3rd day, guided by the greenery that was visible from miles away in a landscape that was otherwise brown and dead. The narrow entrance was easy to miss, but the vegetation growing near it was unmistakable, a ribbon of life in a country of death that told them water was near. They rode through the entrance and stopped. Before them was a canyon that should not have existed. A small cabin built against the back wall, a garden growing vegetables in neat rows, irrigated by channels that ran from a stone cistern, an orchard of young fruit trees, clearly planted and tended by human hands. And above it all, visible as they followed the canyon deeper, a stone dam holding back a reservoir of water that sparkled blue-green in the September sunlight. Water that was worth more than gold in a drought that was killing people by the dozens. A woman stood at the door of the cabin, watching them approach. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, lean and weathered, and standing with the confidence of someone who owned everything around her. She held no weapon, but she did not look like she needed one. Behind her, carved into the stone above the cabin door, was a name that some of the men recognized. A. Vance. Alma Vance. The girl they had exiled 6 years ago for stealing water. The girl they had expected to die within a week. The girl who was now standing in front of more water than anyone in Bezar County had seen in months. Water that she had created through 6 years of labor, that the settlement had never imagined and would never have believed. Erasmus Cotton was the first to speak. He did not recognize her at first, the child having transformed into a woman he had never met. But he recognized the name, and he recognized his own guilt, and he responded to both with the arrogance that had defined his entire life. "This canyon is on county land," he said. "This water belongs to the county. You have no right to hoard it while people are dying." Alma looked at him. The man who had accused her of theft, the man who had bribed the judge to exile her, the man who had expected her to die and had probably never thought about her again until this moment, when she had something he needed and could not take by force. "I was exiled from the county," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, without the anger that she had every right to feel. "Judge Whitfield's order said I was forbidden to return under penalty of imprisonment. That order is still in effect. I am not a resident of this county. I am a trespasser if I set foot across the county line. How can county land belong to me when I am not allowed to be a citizen of the county?" Cotton sputtered. "That was 6 years ago, a child's punishment. No one expects you to honor it now." "I honored it," Alma said. "For 6 years I have not set foot in your county. I have not used your well. I have not eaten food from your farms. I have not asked anyone for anything. I have survived alone, on land that the county did not want, using water that I caught myself from rain that fell from the sky, onto rock that no one claimed. And now you want my water." Cotton's face had gone red. "People are dying," he said. "You cannot hoard water while people die." "You did," Alma replied. "For 10 years, you charged 2 cents per gallon for water that should have been free. Families went hungry to pay your prices. Children went thirsty because their parents could not afford enough water to keep them healthy. You hoarded water while people suffered, and you called it business. Now the situation is reversed. I have water and you do not. What will you call it when I decide whether to share?" The other men in the search party were silent. Some of them had been on the jury that convicted Alma, though they had not been allowed to determine the sentence. Some of them had watched her being driven out of town and had felt uneasy about it, but had said nothing because Cotton was powerful and the girl was nobody. Some of them had lost family members in the drought that was still killing people every week. All of them understood that they were looking at something they had not expected to see. Justice. Delayed, but not denied. Standing in front of them in the form of a young woman who had every reason to let them die, and no obligation to do otherwise. "What do you want?" one of the men asked. His name was Thomas Reeves. He had been a friend of Alma's father before the fever took him. He had not spoken up at her trial, a failure that had haunted him for 6 years. "What do you want in exchange for water?" Alma was quiet for a long moment. "I want nothing from you," she said finally. "I built this reservoir because I needed water, not because I wanted to sell it. I do not want money. I do not want revenge. I do not want Erasmus Cotton to suffer, even though he made me suffer when I was a child who had done nothing wrong except try to survive." She looked at each man in turn. "I want you to understand something. Water should not be owned. Water falls from the sky on everyone equally. It does not know who is rich and who is poor, who is powerful and who is weak, who deserves to live and who has been condemned to die. The water in this reservoir belongs to me only because I built the dam that holds it. If I had not built the dam, the water would have run off into the ground and been gone. I created the reservoir. The rain filled it. The combination is mine. But hoarding it while people die would make me no better than Erasmus Cotton. And I did not spend 6 years in exile to become the thing I hate." She gestured toward the reservoir. "The water is available to anyone who needs it. Bring your wagons, fill your barrels. Take what you need to keep your families alive. I ask nothing in exchange except that you remember what it feels like to be desperate for water, and that you never allow one man to control the supply again." The wagons began arriving the next day. The road from Cottonwood to Alma's Canyon was rough and long, but the families made the journey because the alternative was death. They came with barrels and buckets and anything else that would hold water, and they filled them from the reservoir that a banished child had built, and they carried them home to families that had been dying of thirst. The reservoir held enough water for all of them. The 200,000 gallons that Alma had captured was more than the entire county needed for months. And by the time the drought finally broke in November, there was still water behind her dam, still a reserve against future scarcity, still proof that one person with determination could create abundance where there had been none. The reckoning came in December, after the rains had returned and the wells had begun to recover and the immediate crisis had passed. The county convened a special session to address the water situation, and Alma was invited to attend. The exile order having been quietly vacated by Judge Whitfield in October, when it became clear that the county's survival depended on her goodwill. Erasmus Cotton was not invited. He had left the county in November, his power broken, his monopoly destroyed, his reputation ruined by the contrast between his hoarding and Alma's generosity. His land was auctioned to pay debts, and the well that he had controlled for a decade became public property, maintained by the county and free to all who needed it. Alma spoke at the session, not to demand recognition, but to share what she had learned. "Water falls from the sky," she said. "It falls on the rich and the poor, on the powerful and the weak. The question is not whether there is enough water. There is always enough water somewhere if you know how to catch it. The question is whether we allow one person to control what should belong to everyone, or whether we build systems that capture and store and share what the sky gives freely." She looked around at the faces of the people who had exiled her, who had expected her to die, who had come crawling to her canyon when their wells went dry. "I was 12 years old when you drove me out for taking a canteen of water from a creek. I did not understand then why you did it. I understand now. You did it because Erasmus Cotton wanted you to, and Cotton wanted you to because I was a witness to his greed and he wanted me silenced. You convicted a child of theft to protect a man who was stealing from all of you every day." She paused. "I do not blame you. You did not have choices. Cotton controlled the water, and whoever controls the water controls everything. But I am asking you to make sure that never happens again. Build cisterns. Build reservoirs. Build systems that capture what falls from the sky and store it for the times when the sky is empty. Do not let anyone ever again control your survival because they own the only source of water." She sat down. The silence that followed was broken by Thomas Reeves, who rose and walked to the front of the room. "Mrs. Vance," he said, using a title that Alma had never been called before. "I was at your trial. I knew you were innocent. I knew Cotton had lied. And I said nothing, because I was afraid of what Cotton would do to me if I spoke up." He stopped, composing himself. "I have thought about that silence every day for 6 years. I have watched you from a distance, heard the rumors of what you were building, wondered if you would survive. When we rode into your canyon and saw what you had created, I felt 2 things. I felt shame for what I had allowed to happen to you, and I felt pride, the kind of pride a father feels because you had become something remarkable despite everything we did to destroy you." He looked around the room. "This county owes Alma Vance a debt that we cannot repay. We exiled a child, and she came back and saved us. We tried to kill her with neglect, and she built a reservoir with her bare hands. We took everything from her, and she gave us everything we needed when we had nothing. I move that this county formally apologize to Alma Vance for the injustice done to her in 1885. I move that the exile order be permanently expunged from the record. I move that the canyon where she lives be recognized as her personal property in perpetuity, exempt from taxation and protected from any future claims. And I move that this county build a public reservoir using the techniques she developed, so that no one ever again controls our water supply." The motions passed unanimously. The county apologized. The exile order was expunged. The canyon became Alma's property, legally and permanently, the first land she had ever owned. And over the following years, the county built 3 public reservoirs using the rainwater harvesting techniques that Alma had developed. Reservoirs that captured and stored water from rainfall and made the county drought-resistant in ways it had never been before. Alma Vance lived in her canyon for another 53 years, passing in the winter of 1944 at the age of 71. She never married, though she was proposed to several times by men who admired what she had built and wanted to share it. She declined because the canyon was hers, built by her hands, earned through suffering that no husband could understand, and she was not willing to give any man authority over what she had created alone. Her reservoir still exists, the dam maintained now by the county as a historical site and an emergency water source. The channels she carved into the limestone walls are still visible, smoothed by a century of rain, but unmistakably the work of human hands. Visitors walk through the canyon and try to imagine a 12-year-old girl beginning this work, and most of them fail because the work is too impressive and the girl too young, and the combination too improbable. Above the door of the cabin she built, preserved now as a museum, is an inscription that Alma carved in the year after the drought, when the county had apologized and her exile had been forgiven, and she had become, against all odds, a respected citizen of the place that had tried to kill her. The inscription reads, "Water belongs to everyone. The sky gives it freely. Catch what falls." The families who had driven her out, who had watched her go with indifference or satisfaction, who had come crawling back when their wells went dry, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learned something from this story about rainwater harvesting and reservoir engineering, and the determination that allowed one exiled child to save an entire county, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten engineering that kept people alive before modern infrastructure, made everyone forget how to survive without it. The rain still falls on the Texas hill country, the same rain that filled Alma's reservoir, the same water that saved a county that had tried to destroy her. The only question is whether we are wise enough to catch it